Okay, we can go. Okay, we are live. Welcome everybody, and I'd like to thank you for a very positive response. By our last count, we are probably just over 500 odd people attending the webinar. I'm going to be honest, this is my first webinar presenting, and it is a bit strange because I can't see your reaction. And I was saying to our fellow presenters that I'm not sure an icebreaker actually works in this circumstance, but I'm going to do one anyway. So the story goes, Donald Trump wakes up in the middle of the night and he calls an emergency cabinet meeting and he says, I figured it out. This is how we fix everything. The morale is low. We need to do something to pick up the morale of the country and the world. So the best thing that I could think of that worked in the past was space. So we are going to send 3 people to the sun. And the guy from NASA said to him, Mr. President, that won't work. They'll burn to death. And he said, I've thought of that. That's why we're going to send them up at night. Now, I hope that was a bit funny. And I'm hoping that after this, that will not be the way that you would think about the future, given the circumstances that we're in. Today at the webinar, we are joined by George Ellis, who is a fellow director of mine at Mazars Financial Services, as well as Barry Gordon-Davis and Lawrence Spence from our friends at LABNET. And we also have Ishan Bawani, who is available for questions. Just before we kick off, just on the Q&A process, you will have access to ask questions. Can I please ask that you read other questions and instead of retyping them, just like them. What we will then do in the last quarter or so of the webinar, we will then go through the most liked questions, try and answer as many of them as we can. However, we will go through all the questions and provide a Q&A summary with answers to each of the delegates via email. The entire webinar will also be available to download, and we'll send through those links shortly after the webinar. Right, so today we would like to cover very briefly how your business can survive post-lockdown. And I think fortunately what has happened is we now have quite a bit more clarity around the different levels. The contents you will see on your screen, I will do the introduction, just go through some key questions that you can think of, and we'll hand over to George and the team from LabourNet to go through what are other businesses doing and a framework to guide your actions going forward. So, yeah, so you can go to the next slide, I guess. So where we are now is it's very, very difficult and challenging to give an answer to that responds to every single type of business. And I think you will agree that if you look at permissible services that start from essential and then get gradually introduced level by level, everyone in the audience will have different challenges and different times when they can actually emerge back to the new normal. And I think it's important to state that the new normal is not going to be what you were used to beforehand. There will be lots of changes in the nature of revenue, the nature of your cost base, the nature of your workforce, logistics, etc. Okay, yeah, so we can move along again. Okay, so what we've done is we've basically grouped some of the key questions and just to get your minds around some of the things that are quite important to, sorry, that was my wife making, heating up the kettle, which will stop now. Right, so you'll see on the left a lot of different concepts to consider, post-lockdown recovery, key questions to answer. And I guess the long and the short of it is, if your executive managers and teams don't have sufficient support, you're going to struggle. And you need to spend some time looking at what are the different scenarios that play out in your business, depending on how you can access revenue during the various stages and levels of lockdown, what type of relief is available during that time, and then also what does the scenario look like for you and your business afterwards. And when we speak to clients and they want to solve problems, we kind of tend to analyze and categorize the responses as either being tactical or strategic. And by virtue of that, it just means tactical is a very short-term response or plan or action that gets you across the line and basically solves the symptom. A strategic decision is more long-term focused, sustainable, and addresses the cause. In these type of situations, you have to do both. When we get further along into the webinar, we're going to look at some of the options you have around cost containment, which I think is very important. If there's no revenue, you cannot just have cash flow out of the door. And there are some very interesting solutions out there. There is relief available. The banks that I've spoken to have all got payment holidays and other measures in place. But I think it is important for you to understand that just going to a bank or going to government and asking might not just give you the money that you want. You will have to actually prove and show evidence of how you have been impacted and to what extent that impact is going to last. And we'll get to that as well. Okay, I'm going to then hand over to George and Barry.
Thank you very much, Rian. George Ellis. I'm a director in the financial services practice of Mazars. I've run very large-scale cost reduction programs for some of the large corporates in the past, and I thought I'll share some ideas that has worked in the past, but also that now needs to be taken given the current circumstance that we're all facing. We can go to the next slide. So what you see, we've categorized very much how we see the businesses responding, not only in the short term, as Rian has mentioned, but also how they are positioning themselves for the new normal. In other words, being strategically, operationally, financially, and even psychologically prepared to deal with the COVID crisis and potentially even win where others will fail. Some initial reaction has been around setting up an executive team that focuses on the COVID crisis. And what we've seen over the last week or two is that those teams are pivoting towards becoming a almost permanent team, a team with skilled individuals, especially in the medium to large corporates, that will permanently support the executives, as well as the more senior and next level down managers. So very much making it business as usual as opposed to staying in crisis. That leaves the executive team as well as the managers with the business of managing the business as opposed to consistently responding. Those teams tend to have some specific skills in them: modeling, communication and stakeholder management, finance, strategic workforce management and sales skills, as we have to respond to most of those specific elements. What's also interesting is that we're seeing that there's a results management focus on managing the outcomes of all the decisions that are made on a daily basis, and literally on a daily basis, driving agile delivery across the business and the business defense levers. So quite a lot of reporting going on as to where we are, what government is doing, how the business is responding to the crisis. The next one is modeling the scenarios and managing expectations. So I guess all of us have gone through the process of immediate cost reduction, looking at some really immediate and potentially even tactical responses. And the businesses that are going to win is going to be constructing the short to medium term portfolio of actions that are required and start working on them now. So very much understanding what the cash gap is going to be across a set of specific modeled scenarios, and then managing expectations. That is very important, both internally and externally. Obviously, we need to configure and manage the workforce for the new normal, and you can see what actions some of our clients are taking. Defending revenue, driving sales, and managing cost, again against the short-term actions, as well as constructing a portfolio of medium to longer-term actions, dealing with the new normal. Managing the finances and making sure that liquidity is available. Riaan has already mentioned how the banks have responded. So we will certainly not be fully dependent on government in this instance. The earlier you engage with the banks, I guess the better. The banks do not at the moment, given the relaxation of liquidity requirements, have an issue with liquidity. And I've spoken to some of the CFOs across the banks over the last week, confirming that. So options are available. And then start planning for recovery. That's quite a peculiar thing to say at this stage, but our recovery will come. This is likely to be 18-month sort of exercise, and the recovery will come. Whoever's going to be positioned for that will be doing well. Let's quickly deal then with what we have been seeing other businesses doing, apart from pivoting to sustainable downtime business defense actions, as reflected in the heading. So I'm not going to deal with 1, 2, and 3, which I've elaborated on, 5 and 6 as well, that extensively. But what we have seen is that there's been a significant drive around sales revenue and seeing how to maintain that. Customer engagement and near-term risk assessment on almost all of the customers are happening across the board. The sales pipeline impacts are being reviewed and actions taken per client. Implementation of socially distanced lockdown and post-lockdown sales methods are being implemented. And that's quite an interesting one. In our own case, we have seen that that's been quite successful and doable as customers got over the initial shock. The other big one is obviously moving to digital and digital sales channels and making that work for you much harder than in the past. The update of sales strategies, increased engagement and motivation of the sales force, very important. Reconfiguration of value delivery through socially distanced methods, and then development and delivery of new normal product value propositions. So our current products might, with some tweaks, be much more appropriate going into the new normal. And a lot of the businesses are looking at how do they reconfigure their value offerings to customers. What another interesting was to see is the provision of lockdown discounts to incentivize sales and delivery. Some of our customers have discounted up to 20% on some of the sales that they are doing during the lockdown period to make sure that both their customers but also their own businesses remain in the sales pipeline. And then obviously negotiation of post-lockdown sales agreements already starting to be looked at. I think in the new normal that will be risk-based, obviously, as the government's announcements has happened. Lots and lots and lots of tactical and immediate cost defense actions have taken place. The first one was obviously executive pay and benefits, and then employee pay and benefits. And we've got Lauren and Barry to help us through that as well. But very tactical at this point. Some less tactical, but to some degree, some long lead time activities have also taken place. So some of them would be, you can't immediately do something, but you have to plan today already to implement in the next 2, 3, and 9 months. And those would be to renegotiate supplier terms and payment arrangements, drive early collections and recovery through dedicated and bolstered teams, setting up those teams, and making sure that those new renegotiated supplier terms are kept to. All of the lease term arrangements, negotiations are happening quite extensively. I want to comment on that. We've all learned over the last 3 to 5 weeks that a lot less of our staff actually is required to be at the offices that we rent. So we certainly can take that into the new normal and make sure that even under a risk-adjusted lockdown approach, that we don't need all of the real estate that we normally would take up. And then move inventory and stock at discounted prices. Lots of that happening currently to make sure that under the new restrictions that we at least can get going again very quickly. I'm going to hand over to Barry at this point, and Barry and Lauren will take us through some of the HR related or workforce related actions that we could be expecting over the next few weeks and months, and this will probably take most of the time. Barry?
And thank you very much, George. And that's actually a great segue going into the workforce side of things. We all know that what businesses are doing nowadays is considering all aspects of their business, and most businesses are made up of people. The coronavirus pandemic is affecting people at most. So when we go and we look at our businesses and we introspect on our businesses, most of our considerations are most likely going to be around our people. And we all know that when you enter into an employment relationship with one or thousands of staff, you're contracting into those relationships. You contract into those relationships, and there's now a reciprocal relationship and an obligation on both parties with regards to that contract. I'm going to get into the contractual aspects of that relationship, but the first thing, and I think it's the priority that we've got to have a look at with regards to looking at your business, and most probably the manner in which you're going to come out at the end of this and in what way or form is putting together a action plan specifically with regards to your staff. So what we are recommending, and what us as LABNET are recommending, and it's something that we're doing introspectively as well as a company ourselves, is having a look at first of all the interests of our people. So the first thing that you would put in any action plan would be the safety first principle. Your staff safety has to be paramount to anything else within that business. Once you've then gotten that priority right, the next step of an action plan would then be to try and as best as possible ensure business as usual. Now, this is something that's been very, very interesting for all of us as employers, looking at how our businesses under the lockdown scenarios and under the different aspects and impacts that are happening in the world, how do we then go and carry on as best as possible as usual? Are we on a hard lockdown, soft lockdown, or no lockdown and business as usual? For those that are obviously essential services on the front line, it's business as usual, but a lot of businesses are having to go and really adapt the way that they used to do things. And I mean, you can see all of us. I mean, as a consultancy, LabourNet, we always go out to clients, and we pride ourselves as being that face-to-face interaction and being that hands-on approach to things. We don't just necessarily go and consult via correspondence. And now we're having to learn how to do these things. I mean, I'm sure everybody now has never done so many webinars, online conferences, sessions, whatever you want to call it, through a medium or PC, and it's something that everybody has to get used to, and that's definitely something that businesses are introspectively looking and saying is the new norm going forward. Now we're there, and it takes 21 days to form a habit. It takes a lockdown to form a habit as well, and we can see that we are all now already in this habit of being able to interact with other businesses, interact with our teams, interact with management, interact with staff via these online conferencing platforms. And that's now not it, because we know that this is going to end. Lockdown, we've had our parole hearing, and now we can hear that there's some sort of soft form of it being released, and some businesses are going to go back or not. But businesses are not going to be the same. The third step that we need to do is figure out how we're going to keep the doors open. What are businesses going to have to do in order to make that planning to ensure its survival? yes, we want to all try and thrive through these scenarios, and we always hear these good luck stories about companies that have gone and grown or even started their business in adverse times and during previous disasters and so forth, but it doesn't always apply across the board. We need to have a look and see how we can, for our individual business, try and ensure its survival. And then something that's been a hot topic, we've spoken about it, and I know George was speaking about it, is that the business of the future. What is that going to look like? What is going to be the new normal, and how are we going to get there, and what are we going to do? So before I get into all the technicalities of this, when it comes to the workforce, I think the best way to understand how we got where we are now is to basically look at the bit of a background as to where we've got here. And I'm going to bring in my colleague Lauren, who's the IR executive specifically for industrial relations at LABNET. Just to, that first, when we were all sitting, and it seems so long ago, sitting in March, and we were watching the TVs and we were waiting for that first case, which we knew was inevitable, that was going to then drop on our shores in South Africa. And we then had that first stage, which was the state of disaster being declared.
Thanks, Barry. Good morning, everybody. If I think back the month of March and April, it feels like years ago, and what we've been through just in the last 2 months. So I just want to very practically share what was done, how we implemented, how we assisted companies and our clients from the announcement of state of disaster by our president. So when the state of disaster was announced, we had to proactively meet with our clients, go to our clients and start implementing strategies in order to assist their businesses, their individual needs. So what is important to look at, we started looking at, can the business continue? How will the business continue if lockdown, it seemed by then it would not be inevitable if I think back, but it was inevitable. What would we need to do following what other countries have also done? So we individually went to our clients, we started looking at their businesses, we implemented short time, we implemented reduced pay, which of course had to be done on agreement. Taking our first aspect of safety first into account prior to the lockdown being announced, we started looking and advising our companies to start working from home, if they could work from home, ensure that the employees were set up, have data, will they be able to have team meetings, Zoom meetings, Skype meetings, and then actually continue working from home if that was not possible, and also to assist with curbing the infections. And then, of course, the announcement of our 21-day lockdown was shared with us on the Monday evening. We then very quickly went back to our clients and started implementing, what do we do now? If you cannot come to work, if you're not allowed to come to work, if it's not possible for employers to work from home, what do we do? How do we deal with our staff? What would we do with our staff? So that's also where a new aspect came in, which is called supervening impossibility. And that is where the company cannot work from home. The company is not an essential service. The company would be forced to shut down as a result of the lockdown. And what do we need to do with those staff? Other companies, we could work from home. They were placed on short time, reduced work, paid for less work, or they were working from home at a reduced salary. And then, of course, there's essential services that were required to work even within level 5 lockdown.
So now we went into this lockdown, and we all know what happened. We were prepared for 21 days, and I think we can all figure out how long it was, because that's how much beer we all bought. And then we realized that all of a sudden now that was not enough. Where we thought, let's go and stockpile, the president came in and he extended it for the whole month of April. Now we all know with all the public holidays and stuff in April is a non-event anyway. However, this year it was definitely a non-event. And just to add on what Lauren was saying, and just to get into the legalities about what she was referring to as the supervening impossibility. Now, as I had started off the session was saying, is that employees, and that's where it's very important for this session, is that we've got to almost treat every employee as effectively a creditor to the company. I mean, we all know that you've contracted in with that person to say that they've got to provide a specific standard of work, and you've got to provide them with a specific remuneration. Now, the supervening impossibility comes in where there's executive orders came in from the president that meant that if an employer was honouring its side of the contract and the employees were honouring their side of the contract, they would actually be in contravention of executive orders by the company. It would actually be illegal for them to do it. Unless they were essential services, they had to remain at home. So it was only those few companies that were able to then still continue working as per usual. But the no work, no pay principle comes from that fact that there's this supervening impossibility for both parties to be able to honour that contract of employment as it was entered into by both parties. So that's where that principle comes in, and that's where we've been sitting. Now, we can deal. I think that it's something that we've been dealing with through the entire lockdown phase, which is the intricacies and what happens with public holidays and what happens with people that are in notice and all that. But I think what is more prevalent and more important, and what we need to really have a look at now, is the fact that we were all, we had all marked on our calendars the 30th of April. We had this big X on the 30th of April because we knew from the 1st of May this lockdown would be over. And then we had our parole hearing, and the president said, okay, I'm only letting out some of you, the rest of you need to be at home. And that's, I think, where we're sitting now, where we went to the state of alert, this levels. And as of the 1st of May, we're now going to be on level 4 out of a possible of level 5. Level 5 is where we sit in. We're going to go to level 4. And that effectively means that some of the staff are going to go back to work, some of the staff are not. So what happens to those staff members that now remain under lockdown?
Okay, Barry, so correct. Level 4 would give opportunity for some companies, some industries that will then fall under essential services or critical services under level 4 to go back to work. Very important to be sure that we look at and define what our businesses are to ensure that we do fall under level 4 and are allowed to go back to work. There are companies that were working from home that were not essential services or deemed under level 4 that would need, or level 5, that would now need to start making changes to their business. Revenue is not coming in. More clients are not allowed to render services. So those companies will have to look and see how they would make changes. I think I want to focus now on the companies that cannot render service, that where employees were laid off in the month of April, where employees were forced to take leave, or the employers were forced to follow the no work, no pay principle, and what would happen to them. So with regards to the supervening impossibility, that would continue. The employees would still be under a temporary layoff as a result of shutdown, and they would not earn a salary. What we do urge employers is to communicate with staff, even though we deem this as it is what it is. I would still urge employers to, in any form, WhatsApp group, SMSs, an email, just inform to say the lockdown is extended and therefore the temporary layoff is also extended. But then it gets to what reliefs are there. And I must applaud government and all the different entities and funds that came through and said that they've put up their hand and say that we will help. So there are benefits that is applicable and that can be applied for. I'm just going to name a few. There's loans, so in the form of the South African Future Trust, SAFT, also known as the Oppenheimer Family Fund. There's also a loan through the National Empowerment Fund, NEF. Then there's grants that has been made available, and that is to be applied to the Department of Tourism. The grant is capped at 50,000. The property industry group, whereby that will be applied via the landlords to assist with tenant relief. Vodacom, VodaLend, which is also a loan. The Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development has also been made available. And then, of course, through the Department of Labour and the National Disaster Benefit, there's a new fund called COVID TERS, Temporary Employer Relief Scheme, which has been made available, which is de-linked from UIF, so which means that the calculation is not on the credits of UIF, and that is an online portal whereby employers that are either completely or partially closed down can apply for the TERS benefit to remunerate their employees. And so, sorry, Barry, I want to continue. So this is the benefits available. This is to assist employers. But now the question is, I am working. I'm in level 5. I wasn't allowed to work, but it's way possible for me to work from home. Now we're in level 4. I'm allowed to work, but we've read that it's urged and encouraged that if you can work from home, rather work from home. unless it's necessary to come to the office and work. But if you can work from home, please continue. Let's curb the infection. Let's ensure we hit that decline, and let's work from home. But what then? Is the same rules and relationship, the employment relationship, does that apply? Is employees now, do I need to still monitor their misconduct, their service, their performance? So the answer to this is a definite yes. If I'm remunerating my employee, either on short time, reduced pay, or on full pay, my employee is working, rendering services from home, the normal rules relationship, performance standards must apply and must be adhered to. So meaning if I've got an 8 o'clock meeting, I cannot make an excuse as an employee and say I couldn't attend the meeting, I didn't have data. I use example, it's the same as if I get into my car, I need to get to the office, I need to be there at 8 o'clock. I can't tell my employer, oh, I didn't have petrol to come to work. So the same would apply. The normal rules relationship, disciplinary measures, misconduct will apply during lockdown. And then, of course, now we're sitting at home and we do have more time to be on social media. There's no manager looking over my shoulder. And I think the question is, how do we then deal with employees on social media that may be defaming the company?
Yes, and it might be for employees that are working and keeping most of their time busy with normal productive things. However, as Lauren was saying, there's a lot of people, whether they're working or not, whether they're on hard lockdown, no work, no pay, whatever the principle may be, they're sitting at home with a lot of time on their hands. And as we saw with a lot of people, sometimes idle hands or the inability to trade or the inability to do things can make people do a lot of stupid things. We know that there's in the media, we can see that there's some scandals that have been happening. I know the most recent one was, I think, with Mug and Bean, where one of their franchisees had posted something on Facebook that was untoward, and the repercussions, despite the fact that that franchise is actually closed during this lockdown, is that the reputational harm and damage is like unbelievable. So what we need to know and understand is that we're coming up to a phase of possible extended lockdown. So until we get the final directives from the department explaining exactly which businesses may be able to do some of a release of staff and some that have to remain at home, those staff that are remaining at home under the supervening impossibility are then further extended. I don't want to say a swear word such as TERS, but a lot of people might not be getting paid by TERS, and there's this level of despondency between the employer, between the UIF, and the fact of the matter is that if somebody goes and takes it out on social media and makes unfabricated or untoward or derogatory remarks towards their employer online, the employer, despite the fact that we're sitting in a disaster state and there is the supervening impossibility, the employment relationship and that contract of employment relationship still remains in place, which means that an employer may take disciplinary action against an employee. And I know that at the start of the lockdown, there were a lot of these memes going around that people were forwarding on. Now, you get a staff member that goes and forwards a meme or likes a meme, but that meme is a derogatory or maybe shares discourse towards employers in general or an employer. Now, we've taken cognizance from the Esparta versus Richter and others matter, where the moment you go and like something or forward something or are tagged in something, you become part of that chain of publication. Despite the fact that you might not expressly mention your employer in that comment, the context of that post and what gets done and who could see it also adds to the possible manner in which the company can be harmed by the employee's actions. And not to mention the fact that employees might be ganging up against their employers offline and making statements such as, how employers deal with this, or how can an employer not pay me, and so forth. Employers have the prerogative to take disciplinary action. In fact, we've been getting a lot of calls for very interesting matters that we could not have foreseen. And these are circumstances. I mean, we had a case where one of our essential services employers became aware of an employee that was in breach of the lockdown, specifically that they had crossed borders. So if you've got an employee, and this was a food manufacturer, and you've got an employee that is now part of your team that's manufacturing food under a state of disaster, where there's this pending threat of COVID-19, then goes and breaches the executive orders and goes past province to go visit family members in another province, as an employer, we are all of the opinion that you would be able to take disciplinary action against that person, because the potential threat that they can have to your business. We've seen with chains, whether they're food chains or not, where there's been outbreaks of corona, the devastating effect, not to mention the negative impact it has on your image, is having in those specific scenarios. So, you know, continue to monitor performance, continue to monitor misconduct. But at the same time, during the lockdown, employers have the ability to introspect and look at the structure of their business. And a lot of questions always get asked, and that's the next thing that I want, that Lauren's going to speak about, is effectively how do we now implement structural changes to this contractual obligation that we have, reacting to daily business changes during the lockdown.
Sure, Barry, and I want to define it in the different scenarios. So scenario one would be, as in level 5, I'm essential services, I continued working. The second scenario would be, I'm not essential services, and we're not defined as one in level 5 or 4. So meaning I don't or cannot work and render services from the office, but it's possible for me to render services and I can work from home. Then of course, my business has been half closed or partially closed, and I can still continue, but only half my business. And then the final scenario is I cannot render services. My employees are laid off. There's no revenue coming into my business. So those scenarios I want to just deal with. So as an employer, of course, operational requirements, you are allowed to make changes to your business for operational reasons, which include technological, structural, economical reasons, or similar reasons. So as long as the reasons are true. And the only requirement, of course, is one of consultation. So if it is possible to consult, regardless in which scenario you would be based in, you need to consult. So let's give an example. If I'm working from home, I'm not essential services, and I've seen that my orders have declined. Let's say I'm a marketing company and I've lost, or advertising company, and I might have lost one of my big clients. I would then need to consult, and the same requirements as per section 189 have to adhere to. Consult based on reason, selection criteria, alternatives I've looked at. Are there any alternatives that the employees can agree to? My selection criteria is fair, and I've dealt with a fair and meaningful consensus seeking process before any changes are made. If I'm an employer that is not working currently and my employees are laid off, but I do see that regardless when my level would come up and when I can go back from work, that I would not be able to continue the work as I need to, have to cut. I have to make positions redundant. Then I think the most important thing is, as an employer, you are allowed to consult, you are allowed to start consulting, but as long as there is a meaningful joint consensus seeking process, all the employees that might be affected were consulted with, given the opportunity to consider alternatives, given the opportunity to make representations before any final decision is made.
And I think, Lauren, that what we definitely have to emphasize in this process, and a lot of these call them temporary relief measures to termination due to section 189, such as temporary layoff, such as reduced working hours, such as salary cuts. We need to emphasize that these are all measures that are done within the section 189 process as an alternative to permanent termination. So you cannot unilaterally implement layoffs or short time or any of those shortage of payments. You cannot do that. It has to be through the process. The only time that the process is then done away with is if the employees then through the process agree. Then obviously you don't have to go and retrench because it's an alternative to retrenchment. However, the only time that you can unilaterally do it is where there is a no work, no pay situation. And without confusing the matters, a layoff and a no work, no pay principle, despite the fact the layoff has a no work, no pay principle, the one that is done through supervening impossibility in the lockdown is unilateral because both parties have no control over it. So only when the employer chooses to lay off the staff as a result of their operational requirements that they are forced to do it through a section 189 process, and they cannot do it unilaterally. And I think that segues now into what happens on Monday. Monday comes around and it is now May, and we have the opposite of what we were talking about with the full lockdown now. We're going to have some employees that are now able to come to work, and those that remain on lockdown will be, as Lauren and I were speaking about with regards to the lockdown and the practical applications of that. However, what about these guys that are now going to be coming back to work? We need to emphasize that we are still waiting for final directive on specifically which areas and segments of the industry will be allowed to, and with their percentages and everything that was explained by the president. We're waiting for a final directive from the presidency to let us know exactly what and who can go back. But let's talk to those that can go back without talking about the directive that we're waiting from them. Specifically, getting back to work and the lockdown for you as an individual, as an employee, or for your staff that are under your employer, effectively lifts that supervening impossibility, or that fact that they have to work from home. What effectively comes back into a place is all contractual obligations. So everything that you have entered into with that employee as a contract or as an agreement, and obviously the caveat of that is that you haven't gone through any other retrenchment process or restructuring process where there's other agreements that lead through lockdown and post-lockdown. I'm referring to those employees that were sitting in a no work, no pay situation, or in a lockdown situation that are now being down due to the executive orders being slightly lifted. Their contractual obligations, as entered into by their employer in the initial phase, comes into effect, which means that that employer is then due whatever those contractual obligations are, and all unilateral aspects of the lockdown are removed. This means that businesses are now going to reopen. So talking apart from the structural side of things, our business and our staff, part of that first priority of action plans is their safety. Now, we know we're going to get a lot of regulations from that, but we're going to have this business that's now going to open in a post-lockdown current COVID-19 scenario. And what is that going to be?
I think we keep on referring to the new normal, and I think that's quite interesting, because what is the new normal? I think the new normal for now is I'm buying masks to ensure my clothes are color-coded with my mask. I think that's going into the new normal. But if we look at the new normal, and employees that under level 4 lockdown are now allowed to go back to work, the employer, and if we go back to what we've implemented in LABNET, the safety first aspect, the employer will be responsible from a safety perspective. The employees, as requested and asked, must wear a mask when they go out. I mean, I saw that some of our big retailers have now said you won't be allowed to physically come into the retail store if you're not wearing a mask. So that will be the normal. Employees will have to wear a mask when they go out, when they're at work. Employers will need to ensure that there is social distancing at the workplace. So as Barry alluded to, we are waiting to see what the percentage is of employees that will be allowed to go back to work. What's the percentage that the employer would be allowed to get or to accept employees to work? But from an employer perspective, policy, a COVID policy, what do I need to do if I do contract it? What do I need? From an HR perspective, who do I go to? Will my information be kept? Will be shared? Will it not be shared to ensure there's no discrimination against employees? I think it's important also the safety first aspect from an employer responsibility is the look after yourself as an individual and ensure that you look after your employees to ensure that your employees look after their clients, your clients. If we're not looking after ourselves, we cannot look after our clients. But I think the question then is, so I've put everything in place. I've ensured that there's social distancing. I've ensured that all the measures are there. There's sanitizer, my employees sanitize before they come into the office. If there's uniforms to be used, to be worn, that I'll leave it at the office, and I'll clean the office and I'll clean the uniforms. There's a no hugging policy, which I know some of the companies have implemented. But what happens if an employee does test positive? What do I do then? Barry, I'm going to ask you that question.
Yeah, and that's the thing. So we now going to be sitting with a scenario that flattening the curve is not eradicating the disease. Flattening the curve is really just getting us to a scenario of our healthcare facilities being able to actually deal with the amount of cases that are coming through. And we hear these stories and estimations and guesstimations that by the end of the year, 60% of the population will have had it, but just at a structured, orderly time so that healthcare facilities can deal with it. So what employers need to understand, and they can't rely on the fact that, okay, well, when lockdown's lifted, we're going to have sorted out this disease. It's something that's going to be there to stay. As Lauren was referring to, the new normal that everybody's referring to it. We are going to have scenarios where you have a business and somebody tests positive. Now, we all know that it's going to be almost impossible. And look, when it comes to industry as general, we know with these levels that the president has the ability to go from level 4 back to level 5. I know that there was a meme going around threatening that if anybody laughs at the president trying to put on a mask again, he's going to put Joburg under level 5. But if we get down to level 3 or 2 and the curve starts to peak, he can always push it back. So businesses need to know that we're going to have a scenario where there's going to be cases within the business, and how do we then continue to run that business without having to be forced to choose to shut down the business ourselves as a result thereof. And one thing from an industrial relations point of view that we need to understand is dealing with COVID-19 going forward is going to be the same as dealing with any other disease or illness of the employees. And there is going to be directive with regards to specific types of leave when it comes to the mandatory quarantine period for staff. But in the long-term things, and the things that we need to now start to really discuss is what happens when you have that one employee that's been working for a couple of weeks now and then has that phone call, phones into management and says, I have now tested positive for COVID-19. What are we going to now do to go and trace who was this person in contact with? Do we have to shut down the entire business? Now, taking into account the fact that we're going to have directives from government letting us know exactly what has to get done in that scenario to flatten the curve. When it comes to industrial relations and plain and simple versions, we need to look at the incapacity aspects of it. Some people might have the disease and recover from it like the flu. We're hearing that some people have symptoms, some people don't even have symptoms of it, and that's why there's this extreme risk of transmission, because some people might have had COVID-19 and they didn't even know about it. But then you get there's people in the worst case scenario that are dying from the disease, or that have long-term or have a long-term battle with the illness. Now, when it comes to incapacity and the processes with regards to the employer's obligation, if an employee is now incapacitated, we all know that they have the ability to apply for actual sick leave. If that sick leave and that period of time that that person is ill for exceeds a specific period of time that an employer cannot continue with their employee or to amend their employment in their regard, that's where incapacity processes happen. But I think the point of my story with regards to this is the fact that we need to understand that we're going to be dealing with COVID-19 that is quite fast coming with an attached stigma. People are now almost wanting to prejudice people or even discriminate against people as a result of having the disease or having had the disease. We need to understand, like with any other disease in the country, normal employment and obligations and protections that come in through our constitution would apply, which means that an employee can't be terminated for having COVID-19. But if the fact that they had COVID-19 or the manner in which they have COVID-19 is so severe that it impacts on their ability to adhere to their contractual obligations for an extended period of time, the employer would terminate for those reasons and not the fact that they had COVID-19, like with any other illness, call it TB or even, and that's where we know in our country you can't discriminate against people that have HIV or AIDS, because that is a listed ground of discrimination. However, the fact of the matter is that if the person is suffering from one of those and it impacts on their reciprocal ability to adhere to their contractual obligations, the employer has incapacity measures that they can then follow as a result. So that's something that we need to now look at when it comes to policy and procedure within the business. So what things that we never ever thought of are now coming to the forefront, specifically with regards to aspects that Lauren and myself spoke about, retrenchments, as well as disciplinary action, as well as incapacity. We have now seen that there are very many platforms that we can use to go and do these types of processes remote. The disciplinary hearing, the incapacity process, the retrenchment consultation does not necessarily have to be a face-to-face scenario. Testing witnesses, all those things, but we have to adhere to the rights of that employee, that ability of that employee to have a fair counseling session, disciplinary hearing, or consultation session. We as the employers within our the tools that are available to us need to ensure that their rights are also adhered to with regards to this process. So practical applications need to be put into policy, i.e. the fact that if there is a disciplinary hearing and a person is suspended, they don't need to come in for the hearing. You can actually have it remotely, provided the fact that there's access to the evidence that they may require. All those other practicalities are things that we can get around with regards to any online or call it a online video conferencing platform. Most of those things we'll be able to do remotely going forward, but let's put it in our policy. Let's also amend our policy with regards to the health and safety of the business, specifically around how people that are on the front line of your business, the first line of contact, be it your receptionist, be it your security guard, be it anybody that meets and greets people that are entering into your business. What are their rules and regulations about who they let in, how they let in? Is there going to be a no mask, no entry policy that is going to be implemented? And these are all the things that we now, while we're sitting in this period of time, can plan for the future. And those are the easy, normal, warm and fluffy type of aspects that we can change unilaterally. But another aspect is that a lot of employers that were sitting through during this phase were saying, well, you know what, I might not need all this office space because for the last month, my employees have been able to proactively and at 100% productivity continue from their home office. I need to restructure my business where I'm going to save costs and go to a remote working environment, for example. Whatever the case may be, introspectively looking at your business means that you might need to restructure. But as I said in the first place, the moment you're going to impact people's contracts of employment, that contract that you've entered into with the employees, you need to follow a formal process. So whether they're in lockdown or whether they're out of lockdown, if we're going to amend terms and conditions of employment going forward to adhere to the new norm that we're going to be working in, we would then need to follow that well-known phrase of Section 189. And Lauren, going through the Section 189 process post-lockdown in this new environment, what do we need to look at?
Sure, Barry. So I'm going to look at scenarios where the supervening impossibility do not exist. So let's just quickly recap. So supervening impossibility is I'm a employer and I am forced to be shut down as a result of the level of lockdown. I cannot operate from home. So meaning supervening impossibility would be the employees have been laid off temporarily for the period of lockdown until the employees are allowed to come back to work. So that's the only time that I can unilaterally change terms and conditions of employment. I'm not going to focus on employers that are allowed to render services because of the level 4 lockdown that's been implemented. There will be, and that's what we've heard, we're just waiting for the directive, there might be a percentage of staff that will be allowed to come back to work. The problem is supervening impossibility because of the percentage will not automatically exist. So on the 4th of May, Monday, your staff will come to work and they would be expected to be welcomed back to work to be remunerated and to render services. What the employer then would have to do is to ensure that there is a form of consultation. So prior to the 4th, if I know the percentage that I'm allowed to return to work, that percentage must then be selected based on a fair selection criteria, which we will then need to do as we would have done through a Section 189. So inform the staff, propose the selection criteria, and that could be anything that's fair and objective, based on department, based on LIFO, last in, first out, skills, if there is a formal performance appraisal process in place, then that can be used. So we would then formally do a selection criteria to select the employees that can come or should return to work. The others would then be laid off. And the reason why they would still be on unpaid laid off is because of the supervening impossibility in terms of the percentage that can come back. But let's assume everybody can come back to work. So I'm now a level 4 employer. All my staff are allowed to come back to work, but I cannot, due to my clients, due to orders, due to changes that has happened in the last 2 months, I cannot afford all my staff to come back to work. Option then would be to enter into consultation process and then to offer alternatives. So alternatives would be a shift system, employees work certain days, 2 days, 3 days a week. The options would then be that I would work on reduced pay, across the board decrease, so maybe 20% across the board decrease. That will be for a specific time period. That must be in the documents, and nothing can be deemed that there is a period. So I must stipulate the period, and if the period ends and I still cannot return to my normal workforce, then I would enter into another Section 189 retrenchment consultation, whereby redundancy of positions might be the only alternative that the employer can implement. I think it's just also important to mention, I think if we look at the directive and why they're saying the 33% is to ensure the curve of infection. So it wouldn't be advisable to, if there's only 33% of my workforce allowed to render service, to do that on a rotational system. That's why the selection criteria is so important. So to ensure that the same amount of people at my office until the next level is implemented, and that it's not rotated, to also ensure the curve of infection. As an employer, I've got a responsibility to the employees working.
That's a very good point, and I think to weigh in on the whole purpose of the session, we need to have a look at as well something that is very almost an afterthought. And I find that a lot of employers that I consult with will go and jump into the structural aspects of everything, and they look at the economic savings of a restructure under Section 189. They look at the long-term aspects of it. And never has there been a time where we've had to consult with so many people at one time as what we've been finding during these processes. And the problem is that when employers are considering or possibly going through a restructure or a retrenchment process or a downsizing of sort, one fundamental question that they need to always ask themselves is, can the business afford to do so? Remember, I had said beforehand that any change to terms and conditions of employment would have to be done through this process. The alternative, in terms of the new operational requirements, would be proposed to employees as an alternative to dismissal. So should an employee not accept those alternatives or choose not to adhere to the new operational requirements, they are entitled to a retrenchment. So they can opt in or opt out of that process. And if they opt out, the employer by law is obligated to pay severance packages as well as their contractual notice. Now, with the caveat of when severance packages are due, depending on the reasonability of the alternative that has been offered, let's just take into account that all employees don't end up accepting the alternative, or you're just choosing to downsize on such a large level. We need to understand that when it comes to the process of restructuring, and specifically Section 189, there are two stages, there's two chapters of the Labour Relations Act that could be applicable for employers that employ less than 50 employees, and then those that employ more than 50 employees that are then going to retrench or downsize or restructure that could possibly affect a specific portion of them might fall into the category of what they refer to as a mass retrenchment. Now, what employers don't take into consideration is the costs involved. Can the business afford to go through a consultation process? Now, to meaningfully consult with employees under a normal retrenchment process, it can take on average between 2 to 4 weeks. That's a factor that needs to then be considered. A retrenchment that is shorter than 2 weeks or that is done unilaterally would be naturally unfair. You can't do it. So in order to adhere to the Act, by going through a meaningful consultation process. Let's, for the purposes of this exercise, call it 1 month. Then, whatever the employer has contracted into with this employee with regards to their notice period, that would be due. So if there's a 2-month notice period, 1 month notice period, they need to adhere to that. When it comes to a mass retrenchment, section 189 capital A, there is a mandatory process that can take up to 60 days, which means that with 60 days consultation and then the notice period, plus then any severance that needs to be paid to those individuals, the cost of a retrenchment process can be out of the reach or out of the grasp of that actual employer. And what do they do when they can't actually afford to retrench these staff members? So the caveat to every employer out there who wants to go and restructure or downsize is have a look at the financial consequences that doing so would have on your business, considering the fact that employees might not take that alternative that you then go and offer them. I don't know if Lauren wants to add anything just in closing from our side.
I think just on what you've just mentioned, the alternative, of course, with regards to the period, that's important. After the period, notice pay will be payable. Leave pay if the employees weren't placed on forced leave would then also be payable. But then if there are alternatives offered, and let's say the alternative is within a reasonable reduction of my current terms and conditions, severance pay would then not be payable if the employee unreasonably refuses any alternative offered by the employer short of dismissal as a result of retrenchment. And so meaning alternatives are important if it can be tabled.
And then just from my side and having a look at some of the questions that are going through, and I think we will all share the same sentiment, and I know I referred to it earlier as a rude word, which is TERS. And I know that a lot of people are having a lot of unhappiness with regards to their application process and trying to apply for it and when will it apply and so forth. I can tell you now that that would be a session on its own under these circumstances. We're taking heed of all the questions that have been asked. I know that we said that this session was going to be an hour. We are already past the hour mark and we still got some closing to do. But what we will do, and as Rian had said earlier, is that every single question that has been sent to us has been noted, and all the registered users or viewers for today's session will be sent a Q&A correspondence, basically outlining answers to all the questions that were then posed. Because I can see even when I have a look now, the most liked question has to do with TERS, and there's no short answer when it comes to the TERS application process or when it would be granted. We will get back to everybody in this session through a mass communication, and you will also have that ability to then interact with us and engage with us in that regard. But from myself and Lauren, from an industrial relations perspective, thank you so much from Mazars' point of view of hosting us. And I'd like to put you all back into the capable hands of Rian and George.
Thank you very much, Barry. Yeah, in the interest of time, I think I'll go fairly quickly through the next two slides. The first one is all about the framework guiding your actions, and it's very much relates to the areas I touched on earlier, all around about the COVID-19 executive support team. And that there the message is make sure that you normalize or operationalize how you manage COVID. It's going to be with us for a while, and how we as businesses respond is going to determine very much the economic outcome, not government alone. Understand the scenarios that you operate in and be very agile in responding to them. Announcements could come on a weekly basis. Configuring the workforce, we've spent quite a lot of time on that, and thank you, Barry, again for taking us through that. And don't forget, driving sales revenue and managing the cost is going to be primary in the center of how we manage this process. Managing the finances, liquidity, where the funds can come from, and how we set up those arrangements is going to be critical. I haven't yet encountered a client that has been planning for the recovery, but I guess in about 3 months' time, that's going to be the case. If we look at the next slide, it's very much a framework that gives you a sense of what is your portfolio of responses. and it's all about how long the time is to respond or prepare, and then also how difficult that implementation or change in your business will be. We've all done number one and is still doing number one, which is all the short-term tactical matters. And I would certainly recommend that you start building a portfolio in number two, which is all about preparation, management and recovery, and then configuring for the new normal. Number three, I've seen some of the clients tweaking their existing strategy. So for instance, some of the large banks, which I advise and work with, have already looked at how do they do their recovery plans or recoveries plans from clients that can't pay. And those projects have all been brought forward. They might have been planned for a later date and they've been prioritized. So you could certainly do the same. If you were going to looking at digital sales mechanisms and you have already started that project, by all means reconfigure it, make it sure that it deals with COVID and not necessarily 5 years from now. I've also seen one of our clients that have been working with reconfiguring their finance environment, saying that's a project that needs to continue, but certainly needs to continue with regards to how COVID is impacting their national business. A much more leaner finance team, much more automated, and a little bit of robotics implemented there as well. So you could certainly start populating your thinking around what your response needs to be. I'm going to ask Rian to just summarize for us and close, and then we will certainly respond to you with the full deck as well as a response on the questions.
Thanks, George. So I guess we've seen a lot of the liked questions, and we will, of course, address them. I think one that I saw, which I just wanted to quickly talk about, is there was a question asked around what will the banks require if additional lending is required by a company, and would that include personal surety? So what I guess is important for the audience to understand is that with the Reserve Bank reducing liquidity risk and addressing risk-weighted assets as well as capital to be held, it gives the banks a lot more flexibility when it comes around their asset liability management as well as their credit risk policies. So what you might find is that the last time they assessed you from a credit perspective, your asset base may have grown, it may have changed, and to the extent that they're allowed to reassess that, to give you just an example, in the past we would have banks applying a loan to value of, let's say, 85% to certain assets. They are now able to actually move that to 95%. It should also not be lost that the 2 interest rate hike drops that have been announced, that filters through. So you can actually take that into account, and the consensus is that we are not going to have a hike in the medium term. So that is some of the help that they're doing, and you must please feel free to contact your bank directly to ask them what information they require from you in order for them to make that type of an assessment, look at a repayment holiday. And Mazars have actually set up a team that is available for all our clients and anyone else to help in that preparation and do modeling for you and look at what your cash gap analysis is, etc. And I guess with that, I would just like to thank Barry and Lauren and our producer Yasser, as well as Ishan. And thank you very much for attending the webinar. We hope to have another one real soon. Goodbye.